Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to our first DC Excellence webinar of the new year, in what I think we'll all agree has been a pretty momentous January so far, with this week actually not being any exception to that, with Joe Biden's inauguration yesterday, and also the Pension Schemes Bill finishing its journey finally through Parliament. So both of those, I think you'll agree, are momentous in their own right. So just turning to this morning's webinar, I'm delighted to introduce our three speakers. So firstly, we've got Steffi Nichols-Hinks from our Gowling WLG pensions team. Steffi's a senior associate in the team and works on a wide range of schemes for both trustees and employers, but she's part of our DC Excellence team and works with me on that to really ensure that we're at the forefront of everything we do in the DC world. Next, we've got Lou Sivier from the Pensions Regulator. So Lou is a policy principal in the Pension Regulator's Regulatory Policy Directorate. She's been at the regulator since 2007 and worked in both policy and operations teams across issues relating to both DB and DC. She leads the team that's responsible for developing policy relating to governance and admin of trust-based pension schemes, which includes the future of trusteeship, pensions dashboards, which I'm sure a lot of you are starting to think about, and also the regulation of DC schemes, and importantly, value for money, which is what she's going to be talking to you about today. And finally, last but by no means least, Samantha Pitt from Law Debenture. So Samantha is a trustee director at Law Debenture, working across around 11 schemes, including DB, DC and hybrid arrangements, with assets ranging from 30 million right up to over 6 billion. She chairs 6 of these schemes, including 4 of which are DC schemes. She's really focused on ESG integration into investments and on improving member engagement and communications through digital solutions, which I think we'll all agree seems to really be the direction of travel, certainly with DC members these days. And then finally, I'm just going to talk to you briefly on investment pathways, which are coming into force in February this year, and what really that means for occupational pension schemes. As some of you know on the call, as well as chairing the webinar, I'm going to be just talking to you about that, and I'm a partner in the pensions team at Gowling WLG. So firstly, I'm just going to hand over to Steffi, who's going to talk to us about DC consolidation. Thanks,
Great.
Steffi.
Thanks very much, Jo. So yes, as discussed, I'm going to just cover what the latest position is in terms of DC consolidation. And my first slide is what is driving DC consolidation at the moment, and why is this such a hot topic? And in my view, consolidation is being driven by 2 issues in particular. The first of these is the issue of members having multiple small pots from multiple different employments, which hinders their workplace saving growth opportunities. And secondly, there's the other issue is the increasing pressure on small schemes to consolidate if they are not showing value for money. But in the end, as you can see from the slide, both of these 2 issues really come down to increased government focus on DC schemes to show that they're providing value for money for members and good outcomes for members. And that's a topic in particular that Lou will be touching more on later in this webinar. So I'm going to speak about both of these issues in turn. So first, just turning to small pots, and why is this an issue in the DC world? So there's a number of reasons for this. The nature of employment in the UK has changed quite dramatically over the past few decades, and individuals are much more likely now to move jobs and have lots of shorter periods of service with lots of small pots in turn. And with the introduction of auto enrolment in 2012, this means that these individuals will have multiple small DC deferred pots. So their savings become quite fragmented because of this. Now, in September 2020, the Department of Work and Pensions found that after looking at the books of 5 of the largest DC providers, that almost 3/4 of deferred pots in the sample were smaller than £1,000, while a quarter was smaller than £100. So these are really very small sums of workplace savings. Now, this obviously leads to poorer outcomes for these members for several reasons. And these can include, firstly, the value of their small deferred pots might be eroded, where there's a combination of various charge structures which are applied to them by the DC providers. Secondly, and quite understandably, I'm sure many of us face this issue, members can just lose track of their workplace savings if they've had multiple employments, they've lost paperwork, and as we all know, pensions quite often isn't at the forefront of people's minds. And the sheer complexity of this all can act as a disincentive for member engagement, and so they put off planning for their saving in later life. There is also separately a question as to whether the pension providers themselves will find managing large numbers of these small pots, which is only going to grow, unsustainable in the end. So just turning to my next slide, what solutions have been proposed for this? Because obviously there is a growing issue here. The Department of Work and Pensions set up the Small Pots Working Group to look at this issue, and they've identified a number of recommendations and actions for the pensions industry and government to look at. As a first step, they've suggested that the industry should set up a group to investigate and to address the administrative challenges which would be necessary to underpin mass transfer and consolidation systems, which would need to be delivered at scale within the auto-enrolment market. As the Department of Work and Pensions has stopped short of recommending an exact model for future consolidation, and they've instead said that any final decisions as to this should be informed and developed following the industry's investigation of administration processes. However, the DWP did flag some areas which they said should be investigated further by the industry. The first of these was opportunities for member-initiated consolidation, but they did flag that this would have to be with proportionate member safeguards, as we're all very aware of the growing trend of pension scams. The DWP has noted that pensions dashboards and other technology might help with this, as it will allow members to view all pots with different providers in the same place. However, the DWP has gone on to say that member-led consolidation alone is unlikely to change the trend of increasing small pots. So they have said that the pensions industry and government should prioritise action enabling automatic, large-scale, low-cost transfers and consolidation for the auto-enrolment market. One of their further suggestions related to this was that where pension providers might hold multiple pots for the same member within charge capped funds, the industry could look at ways to consolidate those pots so that they're less affected by all of the different charges. The DWP did name a few of these different consolidation system models which they've suggested the industry look at, such as automatic pot follows member, which is, you know, as it sounds on the tin really, and also the default consolidator, as they call it. And there's a couple of different models for that particular consolidation system, but the basic concept is that everyone would have a default small pot consolidation scheme where all of their deferred pots could be transferred and consolidated into. So that was everything I was going to cover on small pots. And I was just going to turn to the second issue, which has received increased government focus recently, and that is that of small schemes. On the 11th of September 2020, the DWP published its response to its February 2019 consultation called Investment, Innovation and Future Consolidation. Key development of that is that trustees of smaller DC schemes, that is DC or hybrid schemes, with assets of less than £100 million and that have been operating for at least 3 years, will, from the 5th of October 2021, be required to assess key elements of the value achieved by their scheme, which includes costs and charges, net investment returns, and other elements of governance and administration. And these trustees will be required to report on the outcome of that assessment in their chair statement and their scheme return. And where this assessment shows that members would achieve better value in a larger scheme, trustees are expected to initiate wind up and to consolidate. However, trustees will not need to consolidate and can instead look to make improvements where they are realistically confident that the required improvements can be made, and or the wind up and exit costs might exceed the cost of making those improvements, and or there are valuable guarantees that would be lost for members on consolidation. Our trustees will be required to report their proposed approach to the pensions regulator. And should the trustees then fail in their attempts to improve the DC scheme and value for members, they will then be expected to wind up and consolidate the members into a scheme that offers better value. Interestingly, it was originally proposed that the requirements to assess and consolidate would apply to schemes with less than £10 million in money purchase assets, but that threshold has now been increased significantly to £100 million of assets. And this just really highlights that DC consolidation is clearly viewed by the government as being key to promoting good governance and value for members. That's everything that I was going to cover in my slides, unless, Jo, there was anything you wanted to raise.
No, that's great. Thanks, Steffi. I should just say the slides are moving on a bit slowly today. I think my Wi-Fi is overloaded with the children homeschooling, so please do bear with me. There's one question, Steffi, that's come up. There's a couple of questions. So one of which, do we think the consolidation will extend to contract-based, or are the DWP at the moment really focusing on occupational pension schemes? I don't know if the consultation was clear on that.
Yes, I'm not sure if the consultation was clear on that, but I think, you know, sort of it's clear sort of where the trend is going, and the real focus is on making sure that members do have this value for money, and that there's not sort of lots of small pots hanging around for members which aren't getting them any investment return.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, I think, because quite often I think when employees leave an employer, if they've got a contract-based arrangement, they really do kind of linger somewhere, and it's quite easy for members to forget about those, with it being a sort of an individual arrangement also, almost with the provider. So I think it's interesting there that, you know, whether that will be picked up. I think it's something that needs to be looked at.
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
And there's a couple more questions as well, but perhaps if we pick those up at the end, and we'll move on to Lou now. Just bear with me with the slides. Right, Lou, over to you. Lou, we can't hear you. Ooh.
Is that better?
Yes, that's better. Thank you very much.
Hi. Thank you for inviting me to talk at your webinar today. Obviously, am I back?
You're back, Lou. Yes, yeah.
The meeting disconnected for a moment there. Apologies. I too have multiple children hammering the Wi-Fi.
Yeah, no problem.
So
I think we're all in the same boat, so no problem.
So yeah, obviously, value for money is a hugely important topic to the regulator, as you know, we've been talking for some time about the importance of this, and now the government are making many more moves towards pressing this issue, and trying to make sure that we have fewer schemes in the market that are not providing value for money. So value for money is in fact one of TPR's 5 strategic priorities that we set out in our corporate strategy that we published last year. Really, you know, the crux of it is that pension savers, whatever vehicle they're saving into, actually are entitled to expect good value for money, particularly in DC schemes where the bulk of the costs are often borne by the savers themselves, and obviously all of the risk is borne by the savers in a DC scheme. And you know, this has been kind of something that's been growing in focus and also in scope, I suppose, for a number of years now, obviously starting with the initial DWP regulations back in 2015, which introduced the requirement for a value for money assessment and reporting in the chair's statement. So, you know, it's been an evolution over a number of years. And I think now the time has kind of come when it's now about taking action. It's about, okay, you know, what does value for money look like? We need to continue to clarify that, but it's now about really kind of compelling schemes to take action where they're not kind of meeting those value for money standards. So what does value for money look like, though? So my snazzy diagram here clearly illustrates that there are multiple pillars to the value for money equation and the overall delivery of value for money. And you'll notice I'm using the phrase value for money. Technically, in the regulations, the term is value for members, but for trust-based schemes, because we're talking about cost borne by members, but actually in practice, we don't see any practical difference between the two terms, value for members or value for money. We're essentially talking about what's the value that savers get for what they pay for, basically. So the main pillars of delivering value for money really are that savers' money needs to be suitably invested. There needs to be good quality, efficient services, which includes the administration. And also that all of this is provided for reasonable and competitive costs and charges. And really importantly for trust-based schemes in particular is clearly we have trustees. And the role that those trustees play is a really key driver in the delivery of value for money. The standards of governance and the quality of trustee decision making is what drives the outcomes in all of these other areas. So for us, that's a really important component. And that's why, you know, we've been doing a lot of work over the last few years looking at the future of trusteeship, about, you know, how trustee boards are kind of composed, the levels of knowledge and understanding, and how the schemes are being run to make sure that they are delivering that value. And I think it's important that, you know, it isn't just about the knowledge that trustees have. It is about how trustee boards operate as a whole, and that includes, you know, the kind of diversity of trustee boards, both in terms of diversity of skills and experience, but also making sure that members are properly represented. You know, that people saving into DC schemes since the introduction of automatic enrolment are hugely diverse, you know, both in age range and background, and so we need to make sure that they are properly represented. So actually next week we are going to be holding the first meeting of our industry working group on diversity and inclusion on trustee boards, to really try and get to the bottom of this. What does it mean? What are the key things that trustees need to have in place on their boards to make sure that there is enough diversity and inclusion to be sure that the decision making in those schemes is really of top quality? And also, you know, the scrutiny of decision making is another one of TPR's strategic priorities. So it is something that we do kind of put right up there in terms of importance. So just moving on to my next slide. As Steffi has outlined, and as I've touched on, you know, government and regulators, we are all working to try and clarify the measurement of value for money. We know that, you know, at first in its introduction, it's you know, sort of quite a nebulous concept. It's like, well, what does that mean? It's going to be different for you know, each individual saver. So there's work going on to try and make sure that there is some consistency around that, and that there is clear definition and a clear view of what value for money means right across the industry, across both trust-based and contract-based schemes. I think, you know, as Steffi's outlined, the DWP requirements that are going to come into force in October this year is a really good step forward in terms of, you know, of getting schemes to take concrete steps to achieve value for money if they're in a position where they're not doing that at the moment. And what the whilst trustees will be able to put plans in place to improve their value for money, I think there is a clear expectation. I think DWP said as much in their response that you know, it's unlikely that the majority of schemes will be able to demonstrate that value for money relative to larger schemes. So I think, you know, that certainly government's expectation that most schemes will move to consolidate. And one of the biggest barriers for that is around being able to access competitive charges and economies of scale that larger schemes can benefit from. So that I think in my view is what will be, you know, what will be the biggest kind of barrier to those smaller schemes being able to say, actually, we are going to be able to get to a position where we can achieve relative value for money that's on a par. So but it'll be interesting to see how that goes and how trustees start doing that. And one thing that's been really interesting in looking at smaller schemes in the research that we've done at TPR, where we've spoken to trustees about, you know, why haven't they considered winding up, and conversely, you know, where we've seen schemes that have started the wind up process, you know, talking to them about what were the drivers for that. And one thing that's consistently come up that is either something that has historically stopped winding up or has made the decision much harder is the value that a lot of trustees place on having a more personalised service in a smaller scheme. And, you know, we hear a lot of feedback around, you know, well, we know the members individually, we know what they want, you know, we can kind of do the best thing for them. And that's very laudable, and I don't think, you know, anyone would argue that there is some value in that. But I think the question that we really need to challenge is, does that outweigh the value that transferring into a larger scheme could afford the member in terms of the actual financial impact and the actual retirement outcomes that they are going to get? So it's something that, you know, we do hear come up a lot, but it's something that we think trustees really need to challenge themselves about and think, actually, is that really so valuable that we kind of, you know, we don't move our members into something where they could potentially get better financial outcomes. So I'm going to talk a bit more about this last point in a moment, but so the DWP are looking at the kind of schemes with less than £100 million assets under management, and TPR and FCA, we are working together on producing an industry discussion paper which looks at more broadly establishing some metrics and benchmarking for the components of value for money across both trust-based and contract-based. So I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But for now, if we can move on to my next slide. I feel like Chris Whitty when I say that. I'm not as clever as him though. So what my next slide shows is actually, you know, really the evidence for this move towards consolidating smaller DC schemes has been growing over a number of years, and has been really consistent over a number of years. We carry out every year at TPR a annual DC survey. And what that survey is looking for is looking to assess the extent to which different sized schemes, different sized DC schemes perform against 5 key governance requirements. And these key governance requirements are linked to the expectations that we set out in our DC code, which are linked to legislative requirements. So we establish this by, we ask several questions of trustees in relation to each of the key governance requirements, in order to establish a view of the scheme's performance. And as you can see, this slide is showing the latest survey results. This is from our 2019 survey. And the picture that you're seeing here is one that we have seen consistently across the years, and that is that across the board, the smaller DC schemes fall behind their larger counterparts in terms of meeting the governance standards that are required. I think if this doesn't translate directly to schemes with more or less than £100 million assets under management, I think the way that we divide this, we look at the scheme membership size. So that doesn't necessarily translate directly into the assets under management, but this is, this does clearly show that smaller schemes don't perform as well as their larger counterparts. But that's not to say that all small DC schemes are poorly run and that all of them, are poor value for money. We did do a thematic review a couple of years ago looking at value for money assessments on small schemes in particular. And we did find some examples of, small schemes where there was very robust governance, good charging, or in fact, very, very valuable guarantees that were in place, evidence that the scheme was being, very well run, that the trustees, had the knowledge and understanding, and that they had, kind of clear plans for how they were going to, how they were running their scheme and what they saw as its future. And that did include, in some cases, some trustees who were doing their value for money assessment and recognising that actually there's probably going to come a point where we're not going to be able to compete, and that there will be a point where it will be better to transfer our members into another scheme. But the implication is though that not all small DC schemes are very poorly run. That's not the case at all. But it is the trend when we compare against larger schemes. And of course, some DC schemes do still have the majority of the costs picked up by the employer rather than the saver. So that is something that does need to be taken into consideration, but it does need to be stacked up against what outcomes are savers getting from that scheme, even if they are paying minimal costs. I should point out that we've
lost Lou again. Should be back in a minute, hopefully. While we're waiting for Lou to, oh, you're back, Lou. Okay, sorry, I'll let you finish. I was just going to start with questions. Yeah, well done. Okay, thank you.
So I just wanted to point out that we didn't run our DC survey in 2020 because of the pandemic. We chose to not place additional burden on schemes to answer questions from our researchers. So we will be picking it up again this year.
And
so
Lou,
just moving on.
Sorry, Lou, I was just going to ask quickly, we've had a comment really from the audience in relation to some of the statistics on those slides, particularly in relation to master trusts, a comment that it's quite worrying not to see 100% for master trusts checking the suitability of default funds. I just wondered if you had anything to add really to that or comment on that, particularly given now that the authorization and supervisory regime is really starting to get embedded. It was just quite interesting, and I agree, worrying to see that. Oh, sorry, Lou. Oh, sorry. Yeah,
that's right. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So the timing of this survey. So this survey was run before master trust authorization had was fully when the schemes had all gone through master trust authorization. And yes, and there's going to be cases where in some areas master trusts falling down. Obviously, for master trusts now, we don't rely on survey results now. We have a much more robust way of assessing the performance of master trusts, and some of the master trusts that were included in this survey would not have become authorised, so they would since have withdrawn from the market. So yes, I agree, and now we're able to scrutinise much more closely the performance of master trusts now that the authorisation regime is fully up and running. I think there are some. So if I take the value for members assessment, for example, that key governance requirement, I think the fact that schemes across the board still struggle to some degree with this is part of the reason why we're trying to do more work to put more clarification and consistency around it. And for example, the design of the default investment strategy, we know that a big barrier to schemes hitting that key governance requirement has in the past been the element of seeking member views and having mechanisms in place to kind of field member views and to build that into the design of the default strategy. Obviously, there are stronger legislative requirements coming in around that now in terms of the climate change regulations and things like that. So, so that requirement is becoming a bit stronger. But that we know that has historically been a practical barrier, but that master trusts are now sort of getting on top of that a bit more. So hopefully, like I say, it might be that the next time we do the survey, master trusts are excluded because we have another way of monitoring and assessing their performance. But yeah, we obviously want to see the schemes that don't consolidate. We want to kind of continue to see improvements in their governance performance as we go on. So I'm just going to not linger very long on this slide at all, really. This is really just to illustrate that the consolidation of DC schemes has been a trend over a number of years now, and particularly since the introduction of automatic enrolment. So, it's declined by 62% since 2010. So it's already a trend, and I think, it's just one that we expect the new regulations to accelerate, and we would want to see it accelerated as well, so that we're left with fewer but larger, better run schemes in the future. And just onto my last slide then. So this is just to talk a bit more about the work that we're doing with the FCA. I think Steffi's talked about the DWP regulations, and the work that we're doing with the FCA is intended to complement that. The DWP requirements, what they kind of set out is sort of a binary value for money test, if you like. It's kind of, you go through the assessments, and at the end of it, you answer either yes, I do provide value for money, or no, I don't, and here's what I'm going to do about it. As we see more consolidation and we're left with fewer but larger schemes, then actually the value that they provide relative to each other is going to become more important. There won't be that expectation that they will just consolidate. It won't be that easy for a scheme to do it unless they're in really dire circumstances. And also, the large schemes, they will have the resources and the ability to make proper steps to get their value for money up to par as well. So we're looking at how we can put in place consistent ways of measuring and benchmarking value for money around costs and charges, around investment performance, and also across the service and governance elements. I think there's some tricky issues to work through, I think, because the universes that TPR regulates and FCA regulates, they're not the same. We need to consider the role of trustees and the governance elements, and how we reconcile that across both universes. But what we're really aiming to do is try and get in place an industry-wide way of measuring and benchmarking value for money that is visible, that is, you know, that's transparent. So yeah, that's the main thrust of that work. And one thing that I did just want to kind of just pick up on briefly is that obviously consistent disclosure of costs is really important to make sure that these comparisons can be done properly. And we saw last week that the DWP in their charges review paper, they have decided not to mandate the use of the CTI cost template for now, but they are minded to legislate to make that mandatory in the future if there isn't sufficient take up, because actually trustees having access to a clear and consistent way of charges being reported to them, so that that information can then be used in value for money assessments and even member disclosure if we get more requirements around disclosure of costs and charges to members. Then you know, that's a really important element that we need to factor in as well. So I'm going to stop talking there, and sorry about the technical hiccups there, but hopefully people managed to get most of that. And yeah, if there's any further questions, happy to take them.
Yeah, should we just a quick one now, Lou, because I'm conscious of time and we've still got Samantha to go. But when's the TPR FCA discussion paper expected? Is there a timescale on that at all, please?
There isn't an exact timescale. We're aiming for this spring though. It has been pushed back a few times due to COVID and us needing to kind of prioritize other things in the more immediate term, but
Okay.
But we're hoping for it to be in the next 2 or 3 months.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, that was a really interesting session, thanks very much. And now over to Samantha, who's going to share some of her experiences as a DC trustee with us. Thanks, Samantha.
Thanks, Jo. As Jo said, I'm going to sort of give a DC trustee viewpoint and doing what is right for the member. I'm going to try not to repeat anything that Steffi or Lou's already mentioned. Obviously, Lou talked about sort of the 5 pillars of value for money or value for members, focusing a lot on competitive charges and costs, having a well-governed DC scheme, and a bit on administration. I mean, administration, I think, is key because that's the member's first-hand experience. And so, you know, as trustees, you should be monitoring the performance of your administrator on a regular basis. But I wanted to talk a bit more on investments and also then member comms and engagement, and also picking up on some of the regulatory and legislative requirements that haven't been mentioned. So just focusing on investments, and Lou mentioned about a suitable design of the default fund or lifestyle. You know, this is what the majority of members do invest in. They do invest in the default, you know, on average, roughly about 90% or more. So it has to be fit for purpose and ensure that members are going to have, you know, sufficient income in retirement. I think most schemes now offer 3 different lifestyle strategies, being targeting cash, annuity or drawdown at retirement. I know TPR does expect DC schemes to review their investment strategy fully every 3 years, but it's probably good practice to sort of do a light touch review annually. You don't want to be undertaking too many investment transitions because obviously it costs, you've got member blackout periods, but you can, you know, if you've got white labelled funds, make changes to the underlying funds without incurring those member blackout periods. I think, you know, if I pick up as well on sort of the glide path, you know, this talks about when you start de-risking, moving across from the growth phase to sort of the pre-retirement, you know, moving out of high return seeking assets to more capital preservation assets. And obviously that will depend on what lifestyle strategy you're adopting. And as part of that, you want to set performance targets for each phase of that glide path, you know, whether you're looking at cash plus or inflation plus, and obviously measuring that over time. And you would expect those performance targets to reduce over time as you move through that life cycle. And also look at the asset allocation. You know, I mean, I think and that's quite interesting if you look at some of the master trust reports, looking at how diverse the asset allocation is or is not, you know, and obviously you can look at equity, is that global, UK, debt, corporate debt, emerging market, high yield, looking at infrastructure, property, and obviously there's been quite a lot of issues, particularly over 2020, with having property funds in DC schemes, given the gating issue. So you might want to look at more sort of, a real estate investment trust, more of a listed property assets, and then private assets. And obviously there's been a lot of debate about alternatives to liquids and private assets in DC schemes, given the requirement for DC to have, daily liquidity and that liquidity. But there are funds now being structured that do access those alternative or private assets that are allowing that liquidity. And then my sort of big focus that I personally passionate about is ESG and climate change. And it appears that lots of people or lots of schemes use 2020 as an excuse not to sort of really integrate ESG and climate change into their DC investment strategy. And obviously there's a lot of legislative and regulatory requirements now that are going to force trustees to do something if they've not already done it. And I think there's enough member surveys out there as well now that have proved that if a member knows their money is going to be invested responsibly, they're more likely to put more money into their DC pot. There has been a debate about, will you be giving up financial returns by going into an ESG or climate change fund? But again, I think these are longer term investments. And I think over time, that's probably not the case. I was in one trustee meeting and one trustee says, well, I don't believe in ESG. Well, it's not about a trustee viewpoint here. It's about a member viewpoint. But I think the key thing is it's very easy to start looking at moving your equity funds in your default into an ESG or climate change fund. And I think the availability of funds is growing now. There's a lot more funds out there, but it's choosing the right fund. Not each investment manager has the same approach to ESG methodology. So I think as trustees, when you are choosing those ESG/climate change funds, you need to understand the ESG methodology. You need to be able to explain that fund to your members and be able to explain why you have chosen that fund. And also understanding the investment manager's general stewardship and engagement policy. Many of them adopt the same approach, whether it's equity or debt. And then looking at moving your other asset classes into sort of, making them as ESG or climate change friendly as possible. I do hope in the future, and I think there will become a time where we don't separate out ESG and non-ESG funds, because all funds out there will be ESG. Again, there's enough pressure groups out there as well, as well as getting member views on this, places like Share Action, Making My Money Matter. So I think this is in my eyes, is a top topic for 2021 if you've not already looked at ESG as part of your investments. And the final point is on your freestyle or self-select fund range, making sure that you've got a good range out there for your engaged members so they can invest in. And it could be that you may have specific climate change or ESG funds for members to look at, impact investment, or also some other ethical funds. You may have some Islamic, a lot of schemes at the moment have some Islamic or Sharia fund out there. And then if I just move to my next slide, member engagement and comms. I do hope that one day everything is digitalised and we get rid of paper. If we are moving towards an ESG friendly world, then let's get rid of the paper. Most members, and it's irrespective of their generation, are used to looking at things online, particularly over the last year. If they're doing their shopping, they're banking online, they should be able to look at their pensions online. So we need to have fit for purpose websites, with clear language for members so they can clearly understand and can easily navigate. And also a lot of schemes out there are launching apps. There may be, some of them may be quite basic, so a member can see exactly how much money they're putting into their pension scheme each month and how much they may be expected to have in retirement, at their target retirement age, obviously with lots of caveats there. But some of them are obviously a bit more sophisticated, where a member can also input, what, and it's true with the website, what savings they've got elsewhere, so they can get an overall perspective of how much money they may have in retirement and be able to access online, increasing their contributions or, making investment switches. And it could well be that you can launch simple videos out there, you know, just to sort of encourage members to put more into their DC pot. And this is where, you know, a lot of schemes will look at member outcomes using different personas, you know, like Sally, who's age 25, earning X, contributing Y, or Jane, who's age 55, or Mary, who's age 65, you know, being able to try to encourage these members to put a bit more in so they've got sufficient money in their retirement. And this is where you can link in things like the PLSA retirement living standards to give members an idea of what quality of retirement they may have, you know, in terms of additional holidays they can take or more meals out. And I think, you know, as we eventually get the pensions dashboard, you know, that will help members as well if they understand where all of their money is. And again, as I said, I think, you know, you can have different videos here. Annual benefit statements. We have had the DWP consultation talking about simpler annual benefit statements, which obviously has got to be an issue, not just for auto enrolment, but more generally across DC schemes. Again, can you personalise those? You know, I believe as much member com should be personalised as possible. You know, Lou mentioned the point earlier about small schemes feel they can personalise it, but I think that's equally true for some of the large schemes out there as well, particularly those large company trust-based schemes who, you know, many of those do not want to move to a master trust and do want to have that personal engagement with their members. Again, could you digitalise the annual benefit statement? You know, send it online. And at retirement support, this is where I really do feel that that this area needs a lot more scope. You know, this is where sort of trustees and pension schemes have been lacking. You know, a lot of members really don't understand, you know, what a pension scheme is, you know, what to do with their DC pot. And this is where we need to give them a bit more support. You know, obviously we need to be careful that it's not advice, but a bit more guidance. And it could well be, you know, if that member is looking for an annuity at retirement, then maybe the scheme appoints an advisor that they can go to get support and guidance and assist them in purchasing the annuity that's right for them. If it's drawdown, particularly with a lot of company trust-based scheme, if that member selected a default strategy targeting drawdown, then gets to the retirement and then the member has to take their money out. Again, look to maybe appoint a drawdown provider, so you know, part of a master trust, so when that member gets to retirement you can facilitate access to a drawdown provider. And if I move on to my final slide, as I said, I was going to try and pick up a lot of the regulatory and legislative requirements facing DC schemes. Not just, some of this is also DB, but you know, there's a lot going out there. You know, we've got our SIP updates. Obviously, you know, everybody had to update their SIP in October 20 and October 21 to meet the regulatory requirements. Obviously, it's good practice to review your SIP annually and update it, particularly if there's been investment changes. It was touched on, you know, the chair's statement was touched on earlier, and obviously undertaking that value for members assessment in terms of governance, investment, you know, processing of core financial transactions / you know, admin, looking at charges, transaction costs, and obviously needing to show the impact on members over time. And, you know, talking about that trustee knowledge and experience that Lou mentioned, you know, but then who actually undertakes the value for members assessment? Because if it's the trustees themselves, you know, you're marking your own homework a bit. Should you have a third party assisting you with that value for members assessment? And then looking at implementation statements. For a lot of schemes, this is going to be new this year because it only came into force from October 21 and obviously needed to be included in year-end accounts from then. So I think probably at the moment is the first time a lot of schemes are looking at implementation statements. You know, have you followed your SIP? Have you reviewed it? Have you made any changes? You know, you may want to give your SIP to your investment managers and get them to confirm that they have complied with it. And voting data is going to be a key thing. We have had the PLSA template, you know, but I'm sure the first round of implementation statements, there's going to be a lot of data missing and it's not going to be in a consistent format. Then we've got the TCFD and the climate change risk reporting that's going to come into force. Climate change risk reporting from this October will likely apply to large schemes over 5 billion and the master trusts. You know, and a lot of schemes have already declared that they're going to be net carbon zero pledges. Again, how are you going to analyse your climate change risks? What's doing that scenario analysis? I'd recommend that those large schemes and master trusts should probably be putting action plans in place now. Now, all of those documents are going to be in the public domain. So you may also want to think, particularly on the first three, maybe having a bit of a member-friendly version or a guide, because members aren't really going to understand a lot of that. And then costs and charges, I'm not really going to mention much on this because Lou's already mentioned it in terms of the recent consultation and the cost transparency initiative template. So that was all I was going to sort of, a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but just sort of a few highlights from a DC trustee perspective.
That's great. Thanks very much, Samantha. And I think all of our speakers today have provoked a lot of questions. We're not going to have time to get through all of them, but what I can say is we will try and answer them after the event and that you have answers to your questions. But just a couple for you, Samantha, if that's okay. And obviously, Steffi and Lou, feel free to chip in. But one of them, Samantha, based on everything that you said, when you're looking at lifestyle funds, I appreciate this does vary from scheme to scheme depending on your membership. But in your experience, what's tending to be the most appropriate lifestyle sort of default fund for members today?
I think that's quite difficult because a lot, I mean, I'm just talking from my own personal experience on sort of some of the company trust-based schemes I'm involved in, or even I'm involved with an authorised master trust, is sort of establishing sort of a lifestyle that meets drawdown. It's probably haven't got enough history yet in terms of member experience. So a lot of gathering that member experience in terms of, but a lot of schemes are still have got annuity as the main default, but offering the others. So I think it does vary.
Okay, thank you. And then one more quite interesting question, which comes up quite a lot. We get asked the question quite a lot, but it'd be interesting to hear your take from a trustee perspective, how you deal with this kind of point. So obviously, trustees' legal and fiduciary duties are to act in the members' best financial interests. So just because a lot of members want to invest in ESG funds, say, for example, that's obviously not the sole factor. But how can trustees be sure that in making investments that are ESG friendly, so to speak, that they are acting in the best financial interest of members? I mean, I have my own views on that, but I'd be really interested to hear yours, Samantha.
Well, I think as I mentioned earlier, is longer term, and I think the challenge out there at the moment for trustees is choosing the right fund, as I mentioned, and a lot of these sort of ESG type funds are new. So how can you assess their performance? You are kind of a bit reliant on sort of the investment manager undertaking sort of some back testing analysis to give you an indication of what that performance of that fund may have been over the last sort of 5-year period, but recognising this longer term. So it is a difficult question. I don't know what your views are on it, Jo, as you mentioned.
I mean, I think what I've certainly seen in trustee meetings that I've been to, particularly I think with schemes bigger schemes that do have the resources to look at this in quite a lot of detail, I think the data is slowly coming out now, which enables trustees to properly assess and see the value that members can get from investing in those types of funds. So I think as this becomes more to the fore, the regulatory duties, etc., it will be more difficult to say that actually you can't comply with your legal duties if you invest in ESG. A bit like your point, you'll stop having the discussion on ESG, non-ESG, because the financial benefits of investing in ESG will just be, will just happen, I think. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly now, if I can get the slides to work, the bane of my life, there we go, just touch on very quickly investment pathways, and this is new FCA requirements that are coming in on the 1st of February this year, which are effectively requiring all non-advised customers going into drawdown on retirement to be provided with investment pathways to help them make the right decisions. And one of the things that we've noticed recently is that actually a lot of the master trusts, the authorised master trusts that are out there, are already looking at implementing investment pathways for their members, because they are arrangements which will offer income drawdown on retirement. And so one of the sort of things we've been thinking about is actually what might this mean for occupational pension schemes going forwards. And actually, in our experience, and I don't know the experience of the participants on the call, actually a lot of schemes still don't offer income drawdown within the trust-based arrangement, but actually, as Samantha suggested, perhaps they will have some kind of arrangement with a master trust where members can go into that arrangement for drawdown purposes on retirement. But one of the questions that we have been asked is, well, actually, if the provider's asking the master trust to implement investment pathways, when actually this isn't a regulatory requirement for occupational pension schemes, what kind of things do we have to take into account? And actually, I think the direction of travel seems to be, from both the DWP and a sort of commentary that we've seen in guidance from the pensions regulator, that actually an investment pathway type approach is something which occupational pension schemes could be required to provide, because if you're offering income drawdown within your scheme, then going back to, you know, discharging trustees' fiduciary duties, it's only appropriate that you're sort of monitoring that and making sure that members are being provided with the right information on retirement and when they are drawing down from your scheme. So I think where we get to is that if master trusts are being asked to do that, they need to ensure that they have appropriate investment advice, but also appropriate monitoring in place, and making sure that they're communicating very clearly with members, and members understand what their options are on retirement. But I do think that providing members with more information about the decumulation phase, provided it's clear and easy to understand, has got to be a good thing. So that's all I was going to say on that, but we have got some questions. So if the panel are happy for me to, I'm going to throw a few questions at you all in the remaining time we have. We've got about 4 minutes, I think. So the first question, Steffi, goes back to your presentation. And when do schemes that the new value for money assessments are going to apply to, when do they actually have to prepare their first value money assessment?
So it would need to be included in the chair's statement in the first scheme year after the 5th of October this year.
Okay, brilliant. So another thing for schemes to make sure they've got in their business plan for this year. And Lou, just a couple of questions on barriers to consolidation, and just wondering if you have any views on them. I appreciate some of them have definitely got a legal and perhaps actuarial angle to them, but just interested to have your thoughts. So a lot of DC schemes, or certainly some that we come across, will have quite unusual underpins or links to with profits, for example, which can sometimes prove to be a barrier to consolidation because they can be quite expensive to get rid of. And similarly, some scheme rules will contain quite restrictive provisions in terms of how you can wind up and when you can do it. Do you have any views in terms of how trustees might be able to overcome? Will the regulatory regime help based on what you're seeing? Will there be any easements at all, or will it be sort of up to schemes to deal with those kind of knotty issues themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one kind of big knotty issue that has historically held a lot of schemes back is this decision about what's in the members' best interests. And so I think in that sense that the new regulations will help make that part of the decision easier. But some of those really some kind of tricky technical issues, they're not straightforward. I mean, the new DWP regulations, they don't override anything that's in the scheme rules for a start. So those things would need to be worked through with, and if the trustees wanted to rectify things and get rid of those barriers, that would involve conversations with their legal advisors and looking at the scheme rules. And where there are things like with profits and kind of guaranteed annuity rates in place, I mean the regulations do kind of recognise that those things are there. The with profits one is an interesting one because it's one of those things that it's kind of viewed as possibly a guarantee, but actually there is a question as to around how valuable are those guarantees, and I think it's kind of looking at that question of assessing it as part of the value, and then coming to the conclusion as to whether the scheme is offering value for money or not. And then the next step is, okay, so how expensive, how difficult is it going to be to make that transition? And that's where there can be a different decision made if the cost of getting through all of those knotty issues is going to seriously outweigh the benefit. So but you're right, there are definitely some questions for legal advisors in there. So
yeah, definitely. And we've seen some of those being done in practice, and sometimes it is a case, particularly with underpins, where you have to go to the sponsor and say, you know, if you want to consolidate this DC arrangement, there's going to be a cost to make sure members are no worse off if the underpin is crystallised. So we have seen it happen in practice, but it's tricky. So I think we're at 12 o'clock now. So as I said, we'll follow up with responses to any questions that we haven't been able to answer in the time available. But I just wanted to say thank you very much to all of our speakers today, and also all of you for attending. There'll be a recording of the webinar together with the slides available in due course. And the only favour I've got to ask, if you don't mind, if you have time, is just to complete the feedback form that will appear on your screens shortly. And that's it from my perspective. So thanks very much, and I hope to see you all soon, virtually, if not in person. Thanks very much. Bye.
thanks, bye.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.